So my name is Matthew Finnie. I'm the CTO at Interoute, and today we're going to talk about digital transformation. And what we're going to talk about in some regards is how to think about this in a practical way. There's a lot of literature, there's a lot of advice, there's a lot of discussion about digital transformation and what it means. And what we are going to do with this presentation over the next hour is really break down how we see the problem, really break down some kind of practical steps so that whilst there are quite a few unknowns in what you should or shouldn't do, there's also some things that you really can get your head around, things that you can do now, things that you can plan to do, and things that are very material. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to Interoute, because I'm probably guessing that the name may or may not be familiar to everybody. And so it's just to give you some context so that when we talk about some of the capabilities and some of the things that we do, you've got a kind of framework by which you can think that through. So if I look at Interoute, today we are basically Interoute. The way to think about Interoute is Europe's largest infrastructure provider, and we are the kind of hyperscale platform which all the hyperscale cloud providers and mobile operators and telecom operators around Europe and globally use to build their cloud services, their mobile networks. That's our foundation back in 2002. But for the last 12 or 13 years, we've been building what we call our enterprise services business. And this is really built on the kind of very simple philosophy that we are customers, from customers like UEFA to other customers who are trying to build digital services, and we build for them this concept of this managed infrastructure, or as we would call it today, the concept of a digital platform. The company itself, we operate services in 132 countries, and our foundation is the fact that we're probably one of the most connected, if not the most connected, cloud providers in the world. So if I look at Interoute, we are based on the foundation of 2 billion euros worth of European fiber optic network and data centers. And as I said, we're the underlying platform for most of the operators and providers in Europe. This has really led to us developing a broad range of services, and from an analyst perspective, from an external perspective, Interoute is frequently regarded as a leader in managed hybrid cloud hosting in Europe and also network services. Not to mention on the in terms of our global carrier awards, we've been placed in many times over the last 5 or 6 years. And to wrap that around, Interoute has the necessary compliant levels for a European platform. The really key point about that is that Europe is, unlike North America, a much more complex place to do business. It isn't a single jurisdiction supernatural organization. And so you're dealing with the vagaries of local regulations, pan-European regulations, and in some regards just local practice in terms of national markets like to keep data national. So if I look at our customers, the customers therefore are quite varied. So it's everything from the European Space Agency, the Global Fund, which is the Bill and Melinda Gates charity, and some very well-known operators like BT, Vodafone, etc. So Interoute is really about a platform company. We're about a platform company that connects up our customers, and it serves our customers in different ways. So what is transformation? When we look at transformation, there's a lot of discussion about it. There's a lot of people talking about it. How do we view transformation? Well, transformation in many ways is very simple. Transformation is an opportunity and competition in equal measure. The way we think about it is really that what you're trying to do is you're trying to use digital technologies to really derive value and increase the value of your organization. And one of the things that transformation has done, and the way to think about it, unlike traditional technology transformations, which are really being based on the concept of things becoming faster, better, and cheaper, digital transformation now has this added facet, which is that we're seeing compound innovations occur. So we're seeing multiple different factors coming together and creating new capabilities. And so this is bringing together, if you like, bedfellows that normally would have thought that they coexisted outside of each other. And it's making people rethink what their business is about. And just, as a trivial example, if you're a pump manufacturer, for example, and you're the IT manager of that organization, is the fact that you run and manage your own payroll system or HR platform, or even feed and water your own ERP system, are those solid differentiators that create value for the business? They might be, but it's probably a good guess that in terms of how you need to think about your business, they're not the core value. And so one of the key things about transformation, and if you like where it starts, is understanding that core value. And as I said, the other challenge with transformation is it is about this ability to defend and compete in a market, bearing in mind one of the most sort of notable or well-known areas of transformation, if you like, some of the digital services delivered by the likes of Uber and Deliveroo, which fundamentally are the same technologies brought together. One does people in cars and transport, and one does food. But basically what they will do is they will target probably the profitable elements of a legacy business. So not only is transformation about competing in a new market and creating digital capabilities, it's also about defending new markets. But you're defending new markets sometimes with the additional burden of also managing legacy. And this brings into this concept, which we'll talk about later, of how do you, with a digital transformation platform and digital transformation initiative, how do you balance this requirement that you have got legacy versus how you create something new? And it's not just the people, the platform that needs integrating, it's the people also. And the way we think about this, you have three communities within an organization. You have the technology leader, the representative of the business who brings it together, the person who, maybe at a board level or a senior management level, is responsible for saying, I'm aware of technology, I can look at how technology can be used to increase the efficiency of this business, increase the closeness to which we get to our customers. And they effectively are custodians of two quite different approaches. On the left-hand side on this slide, we have the traditional world of infrastructure and operations. Some people would regard this as the kind of ITIL function, the way in which people have traditionally, or waterfall-based applications. You've built applications with big, strong governance levels around them, very solid sort of operational models, possibly not the most flexible and agile in change. But they could be the foundation of your business. It could be your kind of order entry platform, your materials requirement platform. These things will have predated some of the technologies we're going to talk about later. And then when you're thinking about your digital transformation, you'll be talking about your developers, the guys who are really coming in and creating those new environments, creating those new experiences. And for them, the infrastructure and operations really should be something that sits at the other end of an API call. And the governance that wraps around it is possibly not at the forefront of their mind. So if we look at the transformation, one of the things to do within this context is to think about a kind of blueprint. What are the things I can do? Because so much about planning in a world we exist in now is about finding definitive, checkpoints and milestones. And as we've seen recently, there's been work done in the States on a lot of the initiation of a digital transformation, or the creation of an application, if that was to cost you $1, getting it to work in a production environment, or getting it to work at scale and getting it to work within the context of the legacy can add up to another $6 or $7 in terms of cost. So understanding how you can not only create agility, but also manage cost and bring, if you like, the rest of the business with you is something that we think is pretty key. And so we've kind of worked around this kind of 4-point way of thinking about things. And it's really a sort of thought around planning, positioning, and then read and reacting. And the planning is pretty simple. It's plan for change, and changing your competition and changing your customers' behavior. Now this may seem almost paradoxical. How can you plan for change? What does that mean? And I think within the context of that, and within an economy whereby you're dealing with digital technologies, there is a kind of optimal or zero-sum view about what an optimal business looks like. And that's one where you are creating value in the shortest possible time, maximizing your distribution, and timing whatever costs you have to create that value, such that the moment you create value, you may incur your costs. It's kind of the optimal market, the perfect market, if you like. And so what does that practically mean? Well, it means the distance between you and your customer needs to be shorter. And that means giving them more access to maybe your back-end systems. That means allowing them to choose and configure things on you, as opposed to you having structures or people in place that interpret that requirement and then create it for them. You also need to understand how you create value very quickly without costly explanation. That's clarity, that's simplification. Most of us now will be very familiar with a kind of app-dominated culture. But one of the key things that's brought to us and brought to those who have to think about those services is a very, very tight requirement to say, what is actually the information you need to create that product or create that requirement? It's got to be tight, because the real estate on a phone is pretty narrow. So it's tightening up how you think about it. And then, and this is classic cloud, how do you realize that value quickly in line with your customer's expectation? And how do you realize it in terms of your own costs? And cloud, really, the best way to think about cloud is less about the public cloud and more about cloud as a consumption model. Cloud is an optimized way of thinking about your costs versus your demand. So once you've kind of got your head around what planning is, you've got these other three elements: positioning, which I'll talk about in a second, and then read and reacting. The read and reacting are kind of go together. They really are thinking about understanding what's going on in the market, understanding what's going on in your competition, and then choosing how you want to react, and what are the tools and the levers you need to be able to be agile in that regard. So let's look at positioning. And positioning really gets to this point about value. We have this split between innovate and operate, and really what it kind of boils down to is you kind of want to think, where do I create value? There's a recent example of a large grocery chain in the UK who decided that their value was based on their customer experience and their supply chain integration, and everything else was kind of they could get rid of. And so they would insource the creation of those components, those bits of technology, and then they would outsource the rest. And so you kind of get to this point that, you know, ask yourself the question of a platform. If you're sitting there with your list of systems, ask the question, does this make a difference to the sales guy or the customer when you say to them, yeah, we have to look after that system? If the answer is no, then, as we'll see, you should seek alternative options, lighter options, options which don't carry necessary overhead. So you may consider SaaS. If the answer is you don't know, then you kind of park it in the middle. And if the answer is this is clearly value, you might want to think about, are there better ways of implementing that service? Are there new technologies which can maximize the value that you're creating? So you kind of end up with this balance of innovate and operate. And so you're kind of insourcing and outsourcing. If you're insourcing stuff, it should really be things that matters to you and you believe will make a difference to you in terms of competition. So what does the platform need to look at like? And in this regard, you can think about it in kind of simple ways. What you're trying to do is you're trying to create a common platform. Because as we said earlier, a lot of organizations predate their opportunity to use more, if you like, agile or cloud-based services. So they will have useful or valuable or invaluable corporate information sitting on systems that may or may not lend themselves to some of the sort of more agile ways of working with things. And so what you've got to think about is, I want to kind of diagrammatically or schematically build myself a platform. And within that, you can kind of start slicing it up. If, as we said earlier, there are things that really are not going to make a big difference to your world, let's take HR and things like Workday. Workday is an HR package. You can get it, software as a service, and most likely it will do everything you need it to do. Salesforce is another example. These are things which you're just going to say, I need a function that does that, and I will go and get it. So these are your kind of SaaS community. Then you get into your kind of cloud and physical data center. And obviously, there's some fairly well-known cloud alternatives, Interoute being one. But then you've also got non-x86 environments, production DR, test and development, these kind of things, that you kind of got to think, well, actually, I need to kind of group that together. And so you're establishing your core corporate systems, the systems that make up your value. You also, unless you have very solid reasons for doing it, get out of the infrastructure management game. And by that, do you really need to have a DC management function? Do you really need to have that facilities function for those kind of specialist buildings? Does that really add value to your business also? And that, considering that there are people like Interoute, like others, who do this for a living. So you may have, if you're again in the business of retail, you may have outsourced or leased your entire fleet of logistics and your trucks to a specialist logistics supplier. So in terms of DC management and that kind of thing, you should think, well, how do I get myself out of that game? And again, within that context, think of what level do you want to engage with those systems. And so the goal at the end of the day is maximum choice and flexibility. And one of the key questions when you've kind of sort of parked and moved all your systems around into this kind of model, you're starting to create some practical cost savings with your classical IT run costs. And you're starting to say, this is going to be cloud-based, and these are areas which you've got a pool of applications that you then say, well, hang on, some of these I need to put into, I can move into more cloud-based environments, and some of them I'm going to have to move them into maybe lift and shift. And so you have this kind of lift and shift, or refactor or not, that is the question. And really the way to think about that is refactoring should not be forced upon you as a necessity. And this is the key thing. Refactoring should be you taking advantage of the cloud platform, what it has to offer you. And most cloud platforms will offer you vastly more flexibility, scalability, ability to cluster, create high availability instances, and some of them have inbuilt resilience. So exploiting them, that's a smart thing to do. But there's no point in refactoring just because that happens to be the only way of doing things, because refactoring takes time, can cost money, and therefore you've got to have back to your my earlier point of value. You've got to say, where is the value in doing this? And so the way we like to think about it is that you should consider kind of lift and shift, partial refactoring, and complete refactoring. And these should almost another categorization. So you're now creating a matrix of things you're going to push out to SaaS, and then those things that you're going to move to this kind of infrastructure layer, be it infrastructure as a service, be it physical DC, you're going to kind of classify them. One thing on lift and shift, even within the context of lift and shift, we would strongly advise that you have to reconsider, for example, how you renumber your network. Because one of the things you want to create is flexibility. And we've come across in the past lots of classical DC architectures which are really defined as kind of monolithic islands with kind of static routing and static IP addressing. And this doesn't lend itself for the kind of world of portability and integration that you really want to find yourself in. It's a fairly trivial move. You still are, in some cases, literally lifting and shifting items out of co-location into a new place, but you would take the opportunity within that to take some of the advantage of more advanced networking techniques. And so you've now created this platform whereby you've got access to legacy, you've got access to more agile ways of doing things. So what are the kind of attributes that it needs to do? If we go back to our kind of 4 points, this is your ability to read and react. So what does the platform need to do for you? Well, the first thing is it needs to be a two-speed architecture. And I think this is absolutely key. And this comes to this point about building hybrids or hybridization. In most cases, the thing that we do know is that you probably want to group together different assets in order to create that one contiguous platform. So the ability to have two speeds, your, if you like, agile, fully agile, continuous integration type model, customer-centric, running alongside maybe your traditional infrastructure and ops back end. You want to have zero downtime, because one of the things you're going to be doing with this platform is change, and change and update should be zero impacting. You don't want to have a situation where your customers are constantly seeing sort of site down for maintenance, or your supply chain, has to take a plan works for some time because you're doing some updates. So again, it comes back to the fact that cloud platforms these days are, physical platforms, they're distributed. So take advantage of that distribution and give yourself multiple locations by which you have multiple ways of running things. Real-time analytics and continual process evolution. The real-time data analytics, data exploitation is an area that you want to ensure you have. In order to do that, make sure that one of the key things within that context is that you don't create silos. So make sure the data you have ability to exchange it. And within that context, the ability for continual change becomes part of your value creation. So you really are saying, I'm starting to get myself to a point where I am less concerned with the physicality and the infrastructure and how it's running and feeding and watering it, and with my data and how I exploit that data. Within that context, you start to say, well, I'm going to create a product factory. And what a product factory really means is you're going to create many reusable elements. Trivial example could be you could have a web portal for your, or an online presence for your customers, and you could have a basket in there, a basket of goods that you use. This was something that you would use across multiple applications. You may have a standard way of wrapping around a piece of support. Again, that would be a standard module. That means that your developers over time are building libraries of functionality that can be reused over and over again. And this continual reuse, tied in with the kind of continual process evolution, keeps you updating and exploiting technologies. Almost a given these days is the ability to automatically scale these IT platforms. And I think the context there, which is interesting, is that what you're trying to do is you're constantly trying to optimize cost and consumption. Now, there's a lot written about this, and there's a lot spoken about how you can get down to very, very fine levels of cost management. And I think one of the things you have to kind of balance within that is what is relevant for your business. If you have a very kind of spiky profile in terms of consumption, it's obviously going to make more relevance than if you have, say, a flatter profile. But the key thing is the opportunity is there to scale out your IT platforms. And I think the other thing within the context of scaling out is also thinking about the ability to expand. One of the key things that we've worked with a lot of customers on, is they have a template for their business. And so if they create new businesses or open new markets or acquire new markets, they're in a position whereby they can very quickly reintegrate them into their business because they've got standard templates. All of this is building you that kind of is standardizing what on the first flush when we first started looking at your plan and your position with these disparate assets, you're starting to get a much cleaner, flatter, horizontal looking integrated set of services. And then for many, the key thing within a successful digital strategy is the ability to maximize access, but within the context of that, secure the data. And so, increasingly the secure architecture, and really secure architecture really is compliant architecture. And depending on when you're doing business, depending on what customer data you're holding, depending on the transaction itself, it really is about how you think about securitizing the platform in itself. So if you just to recap, if you go through, you've got you're planning for change, you've kind of positioned yourself to understand your assets, and then you've now got a platform which allows you to kind of read the market, understand what's going on, and react in a kind of responsive way. And the level of response really becomes something that we see as you end up in this really very much, kind of two-speed or two-phase kind of migration, transformation program, which you can either run in parallel or you can make it sequential. So when Interoute thinks about this, and when we think about the enterprise digital platform, we've really come at it from this approach of saying, in order to move this challenge on, in order to exploit some of the things which we'll talk briefly at the end about in terms of continuous integration, continuous delivery, you've got to take away some of the integration pain. You've got to eliminate some of the work that's going on. You can't have, every time you build an application, you're starting from the ground and going up. Cloud services have eliminated an awful lot of that, but there still is the ability to get those cloud services, for example, to interact with other ones, and that still means you're diving down into the infrastructure guts, and you're looking at things like networking and how do you make that application talk reliably with this other application. And so the enterprise digital platform from Interoute is really based on a very simple concept. It's based on the concept that if you could integrate up assets, regardless of legacy or agility, and then you could have it present itself as a flat contiguous layer, then you are into a world whereby you're starting to say to the application developer, not only can you develop in a very agile way, but you can exploit assets and legacy that, typically speaking, you wouldn't necessarily think you can work with. And so when you think about digital platforms, the current challenge, if you're developing applications and multiple services, the infrastructure is still fragmented. Even in a kind of best practice ways this diagram shows, you may have a cloud specialist, someone doing some managed services, you'll have some kind of network, and you'll have some kind of physical or co-location provider mopping up those things that just won't go into the cloud. And the key thing that a digital platform does is it kind of eliminates the uncertainty of doing that. It integrates out all of these things, and it provides you with a kind of flat contiguous layer. So all you're really thinking about is the application delivery. So if you look at the components, and the way Interoute split this up is that we've got a software-defined core, which is a global network, and our cloud platform, which is called the Interoute Virtual Data Center. And then at the edge, or the access side, you have edge computing and hybrid networking. And in the context of building out services, the first thing we always advise customers to do is to get everything out of your own premises. As we said earlier, you want to get out of the infrastructure management business, but one of the key points you want to get out of is you being the physical host of it. Get it out of your office, out of the data center that you may have acquired in a location far away from where all the networks connect, and get it into either third-party data centers which have substantive backbone connectivity, or onto a platform like an Interoute or others. The key thing there is that you're building services in an uncertain world. You're building services that multiple communities of interest are going to have interest in. And one of the main things you want to do is maximize access to it. You are far better off maximizing the access by building those services in the core than you are leaving them, if you like, at the edge. But as with all things, there's always going to be things left in offices, notably people, but also other locations which may have specialist needs. And for that, then, Interoute has its edge portfolio of devices as part of the digital platform, which really are about accelerating, compressing, and optimizing application receipt and delivery in those locations. And in the case of the edge computing portfolio, that is also running services locally, because you may be in a location, some parts of the world, not so well served by network, whereby you need to have that ability to say, they're never going to get to the nearest cloud location, so I have to have it local. So how is this different? Well, there's two key distinctives that make this different. The first is this concept of hybridization. What we're doing is we're using networks to integrate multiple clouds, physical DCs and private clouds. And this really is the kind of basis when we think about enterprise transformation. It kind of binds together all of your assets and then gives you a flat playing field in which you can then say, I'm under no pressure now to migrate. I'm under no pressure now to think about how I move things around, because I'm really just moving them around on the same platform. Yes, they may be in co-location, and some of them may be running on kind of cloud-based infrastructure. But in terms of the commercial cost or the contractual commitments, you're out of this world necessarily of kind of overly fixed cost or future-looking ways of thinking about how much space do I need, how much network do I need, because it's on a platform, and that's a key distinctive. The second point, which really is distinctive about this approach, is this concept of interregional cloud clusters and native network integration. What that really means is it means that for every, networks are kind of nodal. So if you look at Europe, Europe is 33 countries and has different markets and different behaviors. Interoute built the cloud computing infrastructure in the form of the virtual data center into these networks, and therefore you have multiple locations in country, but you also have multiple processing nodes. So if you start looking at some of the more portable computing technologies like containers, you've now got, in the case of Interoute, a 17-zone global platform with implicit networking and connectivity, all private, all secure. And you can start building applications where everything below the container is all done for you. And this is really the key concept. It's this concept, as I showed earlier, of horizontal integration. Get rid of, for once, the entirety of the infrastructure debate, not just the cloud bit, but the physical bit and the network bit, and bind it all together as one platform, such that when you start looking at more advanced methods of delivering software, let alone just migrating to more cloud services, you know that if you're developing infrastructure as a code, you're going to have a platform that will work across multiple jurisdictions or multiple markets, or can bring you closer to new markets. So the key components within the platform really consist of the virtual data center, which is essentially built into the backbone. It's a private cloud model, but because the network is the kind of fourth leg of this particular capability, if you take compute, storage, and then network, it gives you the ability to either make it entirely private, i.e. entirely isolated, entirely guaranteed across the Interoute backbone, or it can go out to the public network internet. Interoute has 17 zones globally, and we don't charge for any of the on-net traffic. We don't charge for any of the data transfer in or out of this platform. Why? Because we want to encourage people to build resilient applications. But within the context of the virtual data center, you're able to integrate not just at an infrastructure as a service level, but also take dedicated resources. If you have applications that you believe are going to consume high levels of CPU, and therefore you don't want to be on a virtualized platform, you don't want to be sharing that resource, you want to guarantee the resources for you, you can do that. Or you have a particular security requirement that means that the asset itself has to be isolated from anybody else, but you don't want to lose the opportunity to be working with a high levels of automation and API, then you can do that in the form of a dedicated pod. And then you have what we would call network-aware co-location, which are those things that really kind of mop up those platforms which you are not going to necessarily virtualize in the sort of classical sense. And that could be things like NAS 400, or something more recently, a customer who had an application based on TIBCO. The core cloud compute level is then complemented by global connectivity and access. Interoute is in 140 countries with partners, all using the internet globally, but also has over 300 locations globally for what we call direct fiber connects. And so our model is really about saying, instead of thinking about classical WAN technologies, think about access, SD-WAN technologies, think about optimizing how you get from wherever your edge location is, be it an office or a home office or a large community or campus. And then you come into the platform, and that could be optimized, for example, if you're taking cloud services from, say, Workday. We would then say, well, maybe that traffic is going to go over the internet, and we're going to use Interoute is going to be your ISP to take it all the way to Workday. Or some of that other information is going to go, Interoute would then put it into its core backbone, and then its segregated using MPLS within the core to allow you to create private domains. The nice thing about doing that is you're using the same core compliance method that all your auditors have used for years for private networking, but you're not losing out on the flexibility and cost effectiveness that, say, for example, SD-WAN over the internet affords you. So you're getting the ability to mix and match. This dislocation, hybrid networking, if you want to call it that, of how you think about networking and core domains means that you can be very, very flexible. Just a quick thing on the network itself. One of the key benefits, and people frequently are arguing, I can use the internet. Well, one of the key things that if you use a backbone of the likes of Interoute is one of the largest ISPs in Europe, but also with a global reach. And the thing about the internet, it is very reliable. It is normally quite predictable. But the further away you get, and the map in the left-hand bottom left of it shows you the kind of the clustering and connectivity. The bit in the middle is the Atlantic. What it shows is that you get variability of routing, especially if you're European, the further away you go from Europe. And go back to the slide where we showed you a lot of the popular SaaS providers who happen to be located in North America. Getting predictable connectivity to those guys over the internet, you're at the bounds of where you'll start to see variability in performance. Someone like an Interoute, and if you look at that straight line, Interoute has a much straighter curve in terms of its connectivity because we control the entirety of the network. We're not handing it off at any point to an ISP unless it's taking out into the internet. And so we're optimizing our connectivity, even though it's nominally internet-based connectivity, so that we're directly connecting to popular cloud services and popular software as a service providers. In terms of conditioning at the edge, the compression and acceleration we do with our SD-WAN and edge computing devices. And this allows you then to run a host of different things. It's logistically much neater, single device. It gives you the ability to have multiple bearers and use the internet for some things, and maybe existing access networks for others. And it allows you to do things like run small amounts of application service or caching. As with all platforms of this kind, you have simple automation, so you have this concept of looking at all your resources, and then you have APIs. You have APIs that you can machine build, you can work with the likes of Ansible and Chef and these other automation APIs to create your environments, if that's how you're managing your systems. And the platform itself has been distributed globally. Obviously, given Interoute's heritage, it has a very, very strong European heritage. So we have multiple locations in Europe, and in the case of Germany or Switzerland or the UK, multiple locations within the country also. And the key thing to stress with this is that if you're using the virtual data center in Los Angeles and you're only using another machine in Singapore, the network in between is entirely free and any transfers within. So you're able really to sort of reimagine how your applications can be built and grow without the constraint of thinking, oh, I'm just going to use this regional location, and if I use that other regional location, how do I get there? The getting there, the cost of getting there, and the restraint of getting there is entirely eliminated. And the key thing about this is it means that when you think about Interoute's performance compared to some of the other, if you like, well-known cloud providers, and if you also bear in mind that Interoute in Europe is the kind of reference network for pretty much everybody else, our throughputs, our access, and our latency is always going to be much more performant. And that's where, if you're working within application spaces, heavy content delivery into local markets, you're dealing with high levels of replication between two data stores, then Interoute is obviously going to have a higher level of throughput and able to offer much lower latencies. And that's because fundamentally, in the same way that our backbone is built on top of the fiber, our cloud is built on top of the backbone, and that gives you this kind of very, very tight level of integration. So given that's the platform, how do you then move forward with this kind of two-speed model. And so Interoute has kind of split ourselves into thinking about this in two different ways. Enterprise transformation, mode one, if you want to use that expression, and then the kind of more developer-orientated way, which is a complete abstraction away from infrastructure as a code. And so you're moving towards, possibly along the path to something like serverless computing, but at least infrastructure as a code. Now, interestingly enough, it's, from our perspective, Interoute's classical home, really, in terms of our core customer base. You will have seen some of the names. A lot of what we're doing is enterprise transformation. But a lot of what we're also doing is seeing with our customers is this need for a dual mode way of working. It isn't really a practical option these days to say, I'm engaging on an enterprise transformation program which is going to rationalize my IT run costs and give me some cloud benefits and refactoring. But within that context, and in 2 years' time, I'll start thinking about more continuous integration ways of developing code. The opportunity, and in some regards the threat, is right now. So we really very much advocate this kind of dual speed mode. And in terms of the enterprise transformation, adopting this model, what we work through is this kind of flexible service and governance models. And it's rather than saying it's a kind of managed service or a managed approach, for us it's really about working with a customer or working with an enterprise to understand what the immediate objectives are. And that could be as simple as, I've got a DC lease, it's up in 3 months, and I need to have everything out of that building. Or it could be, I am launching a new product and I need to be launching it in multiple different markets and the transactions need to be taking place, but I've got physical data centers in the UK, or I've got them in Germany, but I'm launching in Italy, or I'm launching in the Far East. And I can't justify the investment of another data center, or I want to think my way through it. So the enterprise transformation use cases are varied and many, but the key thing within them, from an Interoute perspective, is that a lot of it is kind of based on this kind of discovery, design, and migration kind of model. And migration for Interoute is something we do an awful lot of. And what we're doing within that kind of discovery, design, or transition and transformation program is understanding and reaffirming, as we said at the beginning, what those applications are. Which ones you need to rethink, which ones you should refactor, and which ones, frankly, you could refactor, but would it make any difference to your value? Probably not. So you might as well just park it, if you like, within an environment like the Interoute Enterprise Digital Platform for another day or for another time. But the key thing within this context is variable governance models. So some of it you may want tight governance, you may even ask Interoute to look after it for you. You may ask us to run it for you and be the restorative action when something may go amiss. Or you may want to entirely control it yourself. In truth, we see a lot of variability. We see a lot of people changing their minds as they go through this. So from that perspective, it's really something where you're kind of working on a journey, and in many cases, it's defining it up front at a granular level is probably not worth it. As we said earlier, it's about positioning yourself and then being able to read what's going on and react. And that could be as simple as saying, look, I can't hire the people I thought I was going to hire to run my infrastructure. Can someone else run it for me? That could be, I can't find the skills, I'm trying to develop the skills for my DevOps platform. But again, it's proving a struggle. But key within this is you end up with this platform whereby you've kind of organized your assets, you've organized your infrastructure, you've organized everything so that your ability to change is not constrained. You're not constraining yourself because you made a decision based on this infrastructure which had to work with that infrastructure, and now you're stuck with a particular infrastructure type. You really want to get to a world where you are infrastructure agnostic, because as we'll see in a minute, much of the more far-reaching thinking about how you develop and create your applications is really being driven in a world whereby the infrastructure is entirely agnostic, right? Now, the key within that, or the challenge within that area, is, again, comes back to how do I reuse some of the value I've already got? There's no point in having 10 or 15 years or 20 years of enterprise success, and then you say to your business, but if we're going to go in this very new way of engaging with our customers, I can't use any of that, right? You're forfeiting 20 years of value and data. So you need to take as much of that with you. And you need to take as much of that with you and maximize your own opportunity, because the new entrant won't be encumbered by that legacy, right? But also won't have that experience. And that's your value. So you want to take the experience with you rather than leaving it just because your chosen cloud platform doesn't allow you to do it. So that's the enterprise transformation. The Mode 2 area really thinks of it as a further abstraction. You know, we're talking about there, we've abstracted your physical, your cloud-based infrastructure, and you've got an environment whereby you are running, if you like, your global data center infrastructure. As you move into more advanced ways of thinking, you start thinking about continuous integration and delivery, or DevOps. Now, DevOps really is a natural evolution of the world in which we're talking about at the beginning. If you're planning in an uncertain world, the certainty is you want to have, you know, much shorter engagement with your customers, be much closer to them, and also much closer to how you create value. And you also don't want to have long sort of response cycles for your business to respond to a changing customer need or respond to an opportunity to compete. And so continuous integration and delivery, or DevOps, or whichever way you like to think about it, is really about compressing that ability and maximizing, really down to quite extreme levels, your ability to see an opportunity, fix or something, and then correct your course. It gives you much tighter control in terms of the number of releases you can do, the quality of those releases, and the deployment. And one of the great innovations that's occurred within this is, as you move into this world, which is very, very agile, is we've had the rise in technologies like containers. Now, containers really give you the kind of portability that you would like. If you think about it, within networking for many years, the internet being the golden reference, we've had this ability to have portability. We have the ability to move things around. Within computing, within IT, within how you build your IT infrastructure, we've still been, if you like, largely constrained by classical data center infrastructure architectures. And in some cases, even in some of the newer cloud infrastructure, we're still dealing with very physical nature of a data center. And moving things around becomes challenging. Containers introduce a world of very high levels of portability. And Interoute's worked with this technology for a number of years now. And one of the nice sort of things that's occurred with combination of Interoute's way of building cloud into networks and connecting networks to cloud is that you can create your container infrastructure whereby it's all sitting on a contiguous cloud. So all the networking infrastructure challenges are all done for you. And as far as the containers sees, it's just looking at a subnet somewhere. And that subnet happens to be part of a wide area network for which it just accepts it's there. And this gives you this kind of multiple global backbones, and you can create multiple private backbones. And now you really are saying, I am driving out my demand for infrastructure based on the code I'm developing. And Interoute's worked with the likes of Rancher Labs, who really recognized the challenge with people are looking at those container orchestration and scheduling tools like Mesos, like Swarm, like Kubernetes, and said, we'll build an infrastructure, a framework, which allows you to really create those services and build those services. So they just kind of just work. And so you start to have this kind of application model. And as you create new applications and as you create your product factory, you've got this microservice layer of functionality that you can deploy. The thing that Interoute brings to this is it brings very tight integration of that container orchestrator of orchestrator into the network, into the storage, into the cloud computing. And it's that combination that creates this very powerful platform. Now you're looking at the complete abstraction, not just of, if you like, applications like Hadoop and Jenkins, but also network service functions, load balancing functions, algorithmic-based ways of routing stuff around. This becomes, much more flexible. And the key thing with this way of thinking about sort of a pure continuous integration and delivery way of thinking is that the entirety of the infrastructure layer is abstracted away. That combination of Interoute working with the guys at Rancher eliminates the challenges or the kind of complexity of saying, well, I can get it to work on this particular piece of cloud infrastructure, but I've somehow got to get it also to talk to this platform over here. And how do I do that? All of that integration, all of that networking, all of that relationship building that has to occur at an infrastructure level is taken care of. And so you really do have this flat contiguous plane of infrastructure. And that, if you like the ultimate view of it, you kind of have this concept of a socket as a service. You really are saying stuff happens below me, right? If those old enough will remember what Windows sockets did for PCs back in 1995, whenever it was, it just made the network go away. And essentially, this is the same concept. This is making the ability to create interesting, expansive, flexible, and innovative services at a microservice level. And then the infrastructure is just going to be there. And that abstraction is very powerful. And what this allows an organization to do is to say, I'm able now to think about how I can make material cost savings. I can make material cost savings in terms of how I think about my existing IT. I can refactor things and increase the performance of some other areas. But I can also got an opportunity to start early in how I really build an agile way of developing services for my organization. Because you want to start early to build the skills. You want to start early to create the market differentiation. And you really want to start early because it's all about a learning experience. And as you're starting to understand this, your experience and understanding of it will kind of hone that mix of your development capability and your operational model. And that really will define a lot of your competitive difference. And so the enterprise digital platform is this interconnect fabric. It is this network cloud, and it is this ability to give yourself a flat application deployment platform, which deals with your legacy, gives you the two-speed architecture, but is also allowing you to explore and develop on some of the more advanced layers. Thank you. Are there any questions? So we've had a question, is what is the tool set for other environments? In terms of tool sets for other environments, Interoute has, being that we are the underlying platform for many of those environments. In terms of tool sets, really, it's really about our interconnectivity with those environments. So with some of the hyperscale guys, those will run to multiple hundreds of gigabits of capacity. The key thing we always believe in terms of using other platforms is, rather than having what I think some people would call a supplier split. So for example, you're building out infrastructure as a code, your infrastructure, and you're looking at different cloud suppliers. I think a more relevant way of thinking about it is a functional split. So if you've got x86 workloads, you want to put them somewhere, and let's say you're working with Interoute, the locality of our platform is always going to be closer. The access, the latency, and the throughput is going to be higher. So you would probably choose to put them there. If there was a functional split, which say a platform as a service, and you could be, say, using the .NET platform, for example, from Microsoft Azure, you may go through our multiple hundreds gigs of internet peering with those guys and work with that. In the same way that you may say, actually, I've got these following SaaS providers. So I think a functional split is more interesting. And in terms of tool sets, I think Interoute is about bringing together these different assets. Most of the individual providers themselves have fairly deep and adequate tool sets, such that exploiting that from our perspective in that regard really wouldn't buy you anything. What we do is we offer in cases an overlay management function, which allows you then to bring the whole thing together. Another question was, what levels of encryption do you have in transit and the rest are available to assure privacy? Well, the first point to make about this is that Interoute's platform, unlike pretty much everybody else's, you have an additional level of separation because and you have three ways of doing this. You have label separation, so all the connections, all the inter-process communication between your VLAN, you can create an isolated network, and another VLAN somewhere over, is all bound at effectively a layer 2 abstraction, so it uses MPLS. So that gives you a non-routable path in terms of that regard. If you have concern for the sharing of those hosts with other people, then we have this kind of model of saying, well, we'll isolate your host. And if you really, really feel that you want to isolate your host and everything else about it, we can isolate the entirety of the pod itself. We've done that for a bunch of customers, and that allows you then to choose how you want to isolate your traffic. We really, in terms of encryption within a private network, we've always shied against it, largely because it can be adversely performance impacting, and it, at a security level, at a vulnerability level, doesn't do anything for you. That said, if you choose to encrypt at rest, and if you choose to apply your own encryption, that is perfectly fine. It can be done. Some of our customers already do that. Generally speaking, we tend to advise of encryption at rest. You hold the keys, and any traffic, obviously, over public infrastructure, we would advise on encrypting. Another question: how does object storage improve security? Well, in terms of Interoute's object store, again is a platform. In some regards, in one level, looks like a classical object store. The second thing to bear in mind, it again has this sort of private network binding. And it is always built into multiple locations. So it's a very low latency object store. It's also a resilient object store, so it sits within markets. So the best way to think about the object store is that it can be used as a kind of local store. And due to its very, very low latencies, typically in European markets, you'll get hopefully somewhere between 5 and 4 milliseconds. You can use it for some pretty high content delivery type models. The next question was, does Interoute have plans to expand its VDC footprint, say APAC or LATAM? In terms of APAC, we're already in Singapore and Hong Kong. There are plans to extend both north and south, and LATAM, our current position is that we currently have a networking location in Miami, and due to if you remember the slide I showed you on the internet and routing and connectivity, most of the cables are coming up that way, and so we're investigating whether Miami is a good location for LATAM, as well as residency within Latin America itself. Thank you very much for your time. The recording will be available straight afterwards, and if you do have any further follow-up or questions, please contact Interoute directly, info@interoute.com, or contact our head of marketing, jonathan.brown@interoute.com. Thank you.